There we go.
Yep, ready to go.
Okay, thank you very much. And I was working on this even as we were talking just now, and I've tried to make sure I have all my citations on it. If I missed one, I'm really sorry. There's a Cleveland newspaper I don't think I've gotten the citations properly for, or news station, Channel 19, I think. But a lot of this came from Wikipedia and various historical sources, which I know I've cited. So we are going to talk about mining in Ohio. In particular, this is going to be about salt mining. And I discovered this because my eldest daughter, as I mentioned a bit last week, lives in Menor, Ohio. And I bird at Menor Marsh and Menor Headlands a lot. And between Menor Headlands and Fairport Harbor, there's a Morton salt sign. My parents went to a salt mine tour in Kansas. I think it was Lawrenceville with my brother who lives in Kansas. And they told me this was just the most incredibly fascinating experience. And I was thinking about that. And I asked my son-in-law if they do tours, and they do not anymore. Apparently, I guess they used to, but I would be interested in trying to tour at some point. And I'm still going to pursue that because some of the mines are open, but I wanted to dig more into the salt mining in Menor, and I found out a lot of interesting things. And there are not one but two large salt mines in the Cleveland area. Um, so I started digging into the history and things, and it was fascinating. So salt been used by humans for thousands and maybe tens of thousands of years. Early on, used for food preservation, which we know that a lot. Huge factor in preserving foods. I used as a seasoning. Obviously, humans really like that. Most of our bodies made up with a lot of salt in it. I did find out also references in the Bible about sacrificing. They would sprinkle salt on the sacrifices, not human sacrifices, but when you're sacrificing to the gods as such, salt was a precious commodity and they would sprinkle salt around it. Used as fertilizer also, and then destruction. And I was reading this Gospel Coalition site, which was very interesting. But obviously, Lot's wife turned to a pillar of salt looking back on Gomorrah. It was often referred to as, along with raining fire and brimstone, as salt destroying the land and destroying crops and things. So as part of destruction. So in Bronze Age time, second millennium BC, there were many salt roads all throughout Europe, but I was going to call attention particularly to the Via Salaria in Italy. Sal as the background for any Latin speakers here, Salaria. A lot of places, when you start thinking about it, have either the Roman language, the Latin language that includes the word for salt, or their local languages. There are a lot of towns named after salt and a lot of things in our culture also. The Via Salaria in Italy, like I said, was established in the Bronze Age, about second millennium BC. And Via is the road, and it was to carry the salt throughout Europe. It was such a precious commodity from areas that have higher saline concentration. And there was a network all over Europe of salt roads to transport this commodity. So all through history, availability of salt was pivotal to civilization. The suffix wich, W-I-C-H, in Britain, in a place name sometimes means it was once a source of salt. There is a Norwich also, but this was in particularly referring to Northwich. Droitwich also is another. My husband's English, so I was able to correct myself on pronunciations here. It's from the Saxon wick, which means a fortified dwelling or emporium. Cheshire is in the center of salt mining in England, Chester and Cheshire, and the Northwich mine has been active since 1640. It has been a continuous mine, which is just mind-blowing for this country. The Natron Valley also is a key region in the Egyptian Empire. It supplied a kind of salt that was to be called by its name natron salt, and I'm assuming that that's where the Na for salt came from. Today, salt is universally accessible. It's cheap. It's often iodized, which prevents the clumping. Salzburg, Austria, was named the city of salt, and Salzburg for its mines. They had high quality rock salt in Transylvania, Marmuris, southern Poland, Tuzla in Bosnia, Herzegovina was Bosnia and Herzegovina was named. They had special names. The name was So for salt. 12th century on and later, a place of salt by the Turks. Early salt production, they find to maybe 6000 BCE has been identified in excavation in Romania, which is just absolutely incredible. This has always been precious to us, to human beings, and to animals, which we'll talk about later also. So salt was very high value to the Jewish culture, Greeks, Tamils, Chinese, Hittites, other people in antiquity. The Romans really started this as quite a commercial enterprise to distribute salt because it was so needed to be distributed around from where they were mining. So the Romans were known for building their roads throughout Europe, and England, I know of many of those there too. Transporting the roads were built to transport salt to the capital city easier. So that started in the Roman Empire. Salaria, the Via Salaria was originally an ancient tribe from the mountains east of the Tiber River. And it led to Rome from the Adriatic Sea. And the Adriatic had a higher salinity because it was shallower depth and more productive solar ponds as compared to those of the Tyrrhenian Sea, much closer to Rome. The word salary actually comes from the Latin word for salt. One of the claims, which I have actually heard, probably one of my Latin classes, said that Roman legions were paid in salt. And I think there were phrases, and I can't remember the actual phrase, but it used to be a phrase about, getting paid in salt. But they said that they actually paid a salarium, which comes from salt, could have been an allowance to pay the Roman soldiers for the purchase of salt, but that really isn't documented and established very well. And again, I talked about the salt roads, and I apologize for some of this. I was really in a hurry putting this together if it's repetitive or the order doesn't make a lot of sense because I just discovered so much information from so many sources. So they carried the salt roads and from the sources where they evaporated it into the heartland of Germanic tribes at the time. I saw an illustration of caravans as many as 40,000 camels traversed 400 miles of the Sahara, bearing salt to inland markets in the Sahel, sometimes trading salt for slaves. Timbuktu actually was a noted salt and slave market. Salt in Chinese, excuse me about that. Salt in Chinese history drove technological development, and it was a stable source of revenue for the imperial governments also. This is a map. The gray in here, you can see coming out of Rome. That's the Via Salaria. But these were some of the larger of the Roman roads that were salt-carrying roads also. Wikipedia comments. I was trying to find a map all over Europe of it, and there are places in England that are national heritage sites that are part of the Salt Way in England, where they carried the salts out of Cheshire. But I couldn't find any good maps this time, and I'm certainly going to visit next year when I'm over there. But salt has also been the cause of a lot of wars. Certainly territorial disputes over it because it's so valuable. And a lot of it was a role in determining power and where some of the world's greatest cities are, the early cities, arose because of the salt mining. Like, who knew? And you know that they're always located by rivers, but who knew that salt was behind a lot of this? Liverpool rose up from being a small English port to becoming a prime salt exporting port that was dug in those Cheshire salt mines that I was talking about. And it was one of the entrepôts, or Graham says entrepots, for much of the world's salt in the 19th century. And salt mines of Poland led to the vast Polish kingdom in the 16th century. The Germans brought in sea salt, which kind of destroyed the salt mining in Poland industry. And the sea salt at that time was considered superior to rock salt. A lot of tariffs were extracted by nobility or whoever had control of the salt roads. The early governments and things, they charged tax to pass through. Well, salt was so valuable, that was not a problem, and it was paid. and again, causing the formation of cities. Munich, 1158, the Duke of Bavaria, Henry the Lion, decided bishops of Freising no longer needed their salt revenue. The salt tax in France, the gabelle, was enacted in 1286, and that was maintained until 1790. This is a long-standing issue with salt, and I didn't know, and I didn't really understand the value and the history of this. In American history, salt has been a major factor in outcomes of wars. This I thought was very interesting. In the Revolutionary War, the loyalists were intercepting Patriot salt shipments to try to interfere with their ability to preserve food. You can't feed the troops and you can't feed the men, and it would have to be preserved, then the troops are going to start falling apart. And in the War of 1812, salt brine was used to pay American soldiers in the field. The federal government did not have much money. If you've studied 1812 very much history, I know Sean has. They were cash poor, and that's what we used to pay the troops was the salt. Before Lewis and Clark set out to the Louisiana Territory, Jefferson, in his address to Congress, mentioned a mountain of salt 180 miles long and 45 miles wide, and it was supposed to lie near the Missouri River. And at that time, you can understand that was inconceivable value, inconceivable, and part of the reason for their expedition. And I've mentioned before that my husband and I drove lots of the route, the Lewis and Clark route, and we learned a lot about that. During the Indian independence movement, Mahatma Gandhi organized the salt satyagraha to protest and demonstrate against the British salt tax. So quite a history of the salt wars and uprisings there. And as I mentioned, salt preserved the food in the days before refrigeration. And they also used salt to cure leather. William Sherman, General Sherman once said, salt is eminently contraband, as an army that has salt can adequately feed its men. And that's why they were attacking the salt routes and the salt supplies. The most important salt works in the Confederacy were at Saltville, Virginia. The Union Army had attempted to capture the salt works twice, apparently, and it was the last prominent source of salt for the Eastern Confederate States. First Battle of Saltville was in October 1864. Second Battle of Saltville, let's see, it happened 2 months later. Salt works were back to work for the Confederacy. The destroyed railroad system around the area hampered its distribution. So they probably have to go by horseback at that point and by the carts on the horses. So in Georgia, the price of salt depended on one family's circumstances. Heads of families could purchase a half bushel of salt for $2.50. If a widow had a son in the Confederate Army, the price was $1. If the widow's husband had served the nation, the price was free. Local court clerks sent salt requests to the state government, which in turn allotted the salt to the counties as requested. And one way the Southern families would get salt when it was hard going at those times, they would boil the dirts in areas where they had previously cured their meats, which would bring the salt back up out of the dirt. So pretty incredible what they'd have to go through to get this and why they needed it. Florida's greatest contribution to the Confederate war effort was in producing salt. Their salt plants were working 24 hours a day, boiling salt from seawater, mostly in the area between St. Andrews Bay and St. Marks, Florida. Union forces still came down trying to destroy the boilers. Confederate law exempted salt makers from the draft, which I thought was fascinating also. So salt making was a profession that was quite popular in wartime Florida to get out of the draft, I guess. And they said about 5,000 people were salt makers in Florida at that time involved in that industry, which is a lot of people for that time. And this was interesting. There's a place called Avery Island off Louisiana coast. And that also gave the Confederacy a huge supply of rock salt until the Union Army captured it. And there were structures similar to the Avery Island salt dome all along the Louisiana, Texas coast of Gulf of Mexico, which have also could have provided additional sources of salt. The Avery Island one is important. I've got a slide later on about this. It is, I found an article just a few minutes ago, I believe it was June 22nd, that mine is now owned by Cargill, and there was a terrible accident there we'll talk about in a minute, and it is being closed, and the process just started in June. They're going to flood the mine to close it. And that's the oldest, I think it's the oldest operating underground salt mine in the US.
Oh,
So this is something else interesting. I was just Googling things, having fun with this. The largest salt mine in the world is Sifto Salt Mine in Godric, Ontario, which is under Lake Huron. I was actually there. We were at Tobermory on the Bruce Peninsula up in, it's a dark skies preserve, great place to camp. Absolutely stunning place to go to. And when we were driving all the Great Lakes, we went there, and there was a tornado, the first in its history, and it was August 21st, 2012. Our anniversary is the 23rd, so we were there for an anniversary trip for us, our wedding anniversary, and we were there. We had to abandon our tent and go into a cabin, which didn't give us much more protection because of the tornado warnings in the area, and pretty scary in our little small tent. But the cabin didn't give us much more, but it did not hit where we were in Tobermory, but it did hit this town. And we were leaving, I think the next day or two after that. And so we saw the town like right after it was destroyed, the churches that were destroyed, and it was just incredible. But that was like the first time ever, I think in Ontario, they'd had a really destructive tornado like this. There's a YouTube here, which will be linked when this is put on the website. And it's YouTube going underneath and through that mine. And that mine still does tours, I understand. It is 2.7 million square miles. And this is a number to remember. 1,800 feet under Lake Huron is where that goes. So remember the 1,800 feet. The 6 leading salt producers in the world are the China, US, India, and this is in order by production. China, US, India, Germany, Canada, Australia. And those countries account for more, oops, spilled my water, sorry, than half of the worldwide production. And following that of producers are Mexico, Chile, Netherlands, Brazil, France, and the UK. There are 93 countries that were listed in this Wikipedia article that are salt producers, enough to make the list of the largest salt mines and the top producers in the world. Ohio salt. Ohio is the 5th largest salt producer in the United States.
ooh.
And there is evidence that it was produced here 3,300 BC to 1,200 BC even. And it's still going. That's about when it started. 5 Ohio counties produce millions of tons of salt. They're saying, I think just the one Cargill mine alone, 3.5 to 4.5 million tons of salt a year. I mentioned last week that number has actually been reduced a little bit because of warmer weather in the winter time sometimes, because the salt from there, that's the Cargill de-icing technology, and the abrasive part of it. And they don't produce as much and have as many people working the mines when the winters are milder. So it leaves by ship from the ports in Cleveland, going to ports in Duluth, Minnesota, Chicago, Illinois, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and several Canadian locations. They carry it in rail cars. There are rails running right up there because I visited these mines to Massachusetts. And it's also gone by truck, by semis to Southern Ohio. And the Ohio salt, not that there's any difference in quality, but it's in refining and things. They mostly use the Ohio salt for spreading on roads and melted ice and snow, which is a great place for it to be in Cleveland.
Hey, Christy,
Yeah.
I don't know if you knew this, but about 8 years ago, I was involved with the Attorney General's lawsuit against both Cargill and
Morton.
about how they used rock salt and how they use those trucks to actually truck it around Ohio and to other states. And they settled at the last minute, literally on the courthouse steps.
Oh my
But it
goodness.
was a huge conspiracy. about how they handled the contracts and how much they charged per ton of salt and stuff like that. So we actually, people from our office got to tour the mines, even though, like you mentioned, they're not open for touring anymore. Got a huge rock salt crystal that's about 24 inches tall and about
Wow.
9 inches wide. And they take it along to give talks and stuff now. But yeah, I learned a lot about rock salt then too. So it's very interesting to hear the history that kind of leads up to it, and then our little part of it that we had.
Very cool, Sean. And here's another reason why the Ohio Attorney General's office, and this was in a slide, I've got a couple of slides up from now, but I'll bring it up now, is that land that Cargill and Morton Salt lease, they are mining underneath Lake Erie. Ohio has the mineral rights to that. The state of Ohio owns that land. They lease the land. Potentially, they could extend the mines to the Canada border under Lake Erie. And this will also come up again, as you will see that 1800 number. Lake Erie is one of the shallowest. It is the shallowest of the Great Lakes. It's like 64, 65 feet deep. And the mine is 1800 feet below Lake Erie, just as where the salt deposits are for the largest mine in Godric, Canada, in Ontario. So, but I was surprised to find that out, that this is land leased from the state of Ohio. These were previously more like family-run mines. And my husband worked with somebody whose family originally, he believes, had either owned that mine or something, but a partial owners or started it or whatever. And the guy actually had worked there for a while before he came to work for where my husband works. So we've been trying to get a hold of him, but he hasn't responded. So we're not sure if he moved, but it'd be fascinating to talk to him. And this was before Cargill took over that particular mine at Whiskey Island near Wendy Park in Cleveland. So 1970 or 1794, salt was worth $6 to $8 a bushel. And I really should have done the math on how much that would be right now in our dollars today, but that was a lot of money back then. And there were expeditions throughout the Indian country near the Cider River, discovering salt springs throughout there. And I'm thinking that Salt Fork State Park was one of the areas also. There's got to be a reason for that name, and just ran out of time this week to look into this. But we do hear about in pioneer times about salt licks all the time. And the pioneers would watch the animals and where they would go in dusk, because they would find these salt licks because the animals needed it also. And I apologize for the language in this quote about the savages and such like. So there were threats on their lives of the pioneers going to explore, trying to find where the salt licks were and the sources of the salt spring. 10 or 12 in number attacked him, I guess. He found some of the saline water. He boiled some of it down on the spot in their camp kettle, and they made about a tablespoon of salt, but nearly lost his life for that from an Indian who discovered them in there, because again, the natives knew where salt licks were and the salt springs were, and that was as much of a commodity to them for the preservation of things. So just, you can watch the YouTube later. I won't read all these quotes, but there were, a lot of problems with this at the time. And Don knows a little bit about this also, the Indian Wars and where villages were located and how the pioneers were a threat. And they were looking for salt, just as the Native Americans knew where they were, and they would do all kinds of trickery trying to get a hold of it and trying to claim the land and trying to use it. And they were met with a lot of opposition and a lot of violence happened over this. They were saying they narrowly escaped sometimes. That was an article from 2019 in Miggs Indie Press about early salt mining history in the Ohio River Valley. So in Fairport, so in the one by Fairport Harbor between Menor Headlands and Fairport, I visited there, I guess it's been 3 weeks now. And that's like 1,800 to 2,000 feet below Lake Erie. And it's a 4-minute elevator ride to get into the mine. This is a picture that I took when I was out there. And they have a series of airlocks that control the air pressure inside the mine. Outside air is pumped down the mine shaft to supply oxygen to the miners, as most modern mines do. I guess I'm missing some things about that. But the miners are required to wear headlamps and helmets, obviously. And the breathing situation in the mines, from some pictures you'll see later, it's unless you have respiration equipment, this is pretty dangerous and always has been historically pretty dangerous. Why they used a lot of slaves for it in Europe, because it's just clouds of salt inside. You're breathing that all of the time. It's getting on you, getting in your eyes, and so they are taking more safety measures now. But this was kind of fun driving by. There are high fences all the way around it. You can't get very close. It wasn't tremendously active with many cars at that time, because from what I understand, these just start gearing up in the fall. They pump out a ton of salt. They have a lot of reserves here behind it. And this is mostly a wintertime production that they need. And they've got to go for the contracts that Sean talked about here too. But it's just in an area that's really surprising about Morton Salt in the houses. I think I guess I've left a picture out somehow, but I did have a picture of the large piles of mountains of salt behind these buildings. But it literally is mountains of white salt there. It was interesting to see that. From their website, I was doing some digging around, and there are only 69 employees at this location. And you're thinking they can produce millions of tons of salt. Morton Salt's been in business for 184 years, an old company, but it's no longer family owned. And they said that Morton Salt began during the gold rush, 1848. And they said there was a seemingly endless demand for salt for the adventure seekers moving west, of course, preserving food. You know, shooting the bison, preserving the venison that they would shoot, other animals, pickling the vegetables they would use. And they called salt white gold throughout the ages. The company incorporated in 1910 as the Morton Salt Company. In 1911, they were saying, well, there are problems with salt because with this humidity, you have to regrind it and try to use it. And it was hard for cooks to use it, having to pound it and break it apart and shave it off. And so Morton began adding magnesium carbonate, which is an anti-caking agent to salt. Since then, it has now changed to calcium silicate that they use to create a free-flowing salt. And this was a huge advertising campaign back then about the free-flowing salt. 1922, Joy Morton, to commemorate his father's good works for the salt company, making a lot of money. He dedicated his farm in Lisle, Illinois as the Morton Arboretum. It is now over 1,700 acres of trees and flowers with plants from all over the world. And I would really like to go there. I'm going to put it on my list. In 1961, Joy Morton's only son, Sterling Morton, set aside funds for the Morton wing of the Art Institute of Chicago before he died. In 1984, Morton deeded 1,200 acres of Salt Lake wetlands in Utah to the Nature Conservancy, which I very much support. And I have visited salt flats out there, and it's just quite interesting out west. Morton granted $1 million to the construction of the Henry Crown Space Center and Omnimax Theater at the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry, which I've been in there before. I don't remember seeing any Morton signs on there, but and they did a earlier significant financial pledge to U.S. Space Camp in Huntsville, Alabama. In 2009, a German company, I don't know how the acquisition went, but they acquired and merged it to K&S Aktiengesellschaft, the K&S Group, which is the world's leading producer of salt and supplies of standard and specialty fertilizers. So salt goes hand in hand with the fertilizer business also. Yeah, this was the one that I was missing. So I took this through the fence with my lens going up through the fence, and Graham, my husband, was trying to keep me out of trouble there. But I was just ready to say, hey, I'm doing a nature show on this and trying to get more information. But as you can see, nothing is running. The conveyors aren't running out of the mine. But there are just mountains and mountains of salt on this relatively small property here. So, but not being trucked in, not really working right now. Quite interesting. But look, if it were a wintertime in Cleveland, you wouldn't be able to tell that from the piles of plowed snow there. So, and this is right by the lake, Lake Erie. That's another one I took, showing the structures and the levels of the salt piles there, and one very dirty looking pile there, actually. I just took some close-ups through the fence of the operations and the pulley system and things that they do to bring the salt up. So the Cargill Cleveland mine, as I said, it's at Wendy Park, and it's on what's called Whiskey Island, right downtown Cleveland. A little bit tough to get to. Let me tell you, you can go astray with Google Maps on that one quite a bit. We had a little trouble getting there, but it's just the way that you can cross over and get to the roads to that. But Cargill De-icing Technology bought the Cleveland mine in 1997. So this is, again, a pretty recent acquisition. The mine was built in 1958, not as old as these ones in the 1600s and BCEs that we have also. And the mine is 1,800 feet below Lake Erie, which is the shallowest Great Lake, as I said, at 65 feet. The mine currently is about 5 miles wide and growing, and it extends 3 miles north under Lake Erie, and part of the Great Eastern Salt Basin, which is fascinating to look that up if you've got the time. The Great Eastern Salt Basin runs Michigan to New York through Ontario. And as I said, that land is leased from the state of Ohio that these mines under Lake Erie are using for production. The Cargill one, I said last year, I think I thought it said 3.5 million tons, 4 million, sometimes 4.5 million tons of salt a year, depending on demand. Now, these are pictures I hope I credited okay. I just got them from Google. I wanted to show some of the haziness in the bottom left picture. That's just the atmosphere underground all the time with that salt haze. These days, it's done mostly by blasting. The top left picture is an overview. It's really hard to get a picture of this because you can see the train tracks in the background, the extensive railway operations that come out of there. And then we had to be like, we were like on a drawbridge across the river from it. And I was trying to get pictures, and it was really difficult because of traffic. I do have some, but I just thought I would get pictures online and credit the online ones. Sorry, first. The one on the right, what they've talked about is they have, they leave walls of salt as pillars for support. And that's going to come in a little bit later. But can you imagine this 1,800 feet below Lake Erie, ride the elevators down in here? I'm not sure if I put that on the stats, but I remember reading, I think that there were something like 260 people employed at this location. So the oldest, and I was looking into this with the Cargill information, the oldest US salt mine is being shut down, as I said, and that was the Avery Island mine. There was a roof collapse in December 2020, and it's now being shut down by flooding it. And I found an article that just before we came on, I just found that and was reading about it. Cargill still owns 2 other mines, also in the Cayuga Lake, New York area. And that mine is being looked at for safety right now, also because of the roof collapse of Avery Island. And the Avery Island mine has been flooded periodically also. And this is the sign at Avery Island at the mine. And it said, salt was originally evaporated from Bryan Springs and Avery Island since 1791. On May 4th, 1862, workmen were enlarging the springs to produce more salt. The Confederacy hit solid rock salt at a depth of only 16 feet. So the mining operations going lower and lower began to really try to extract the salt there. And that was the first mine of that type in North America. So when you figure how long ago the European mines were going, it's not old, but that's old by United States standards. And beginning the in-ground mining also. And it said this type of mining in North America, they were begun and continued until destruction of the salt works on April 17th, 1863 by Union forces. But there is still mining at that location by Cargill now. And I'm not sure how long they've owned it, but that is being investigated for more safety and trying to prove its safety also now. So where does the salt come from? If you've been in our the geology classes and that we've done here, and also the glacier, species that we've talked about here. I'm going to go into that a little bit here, and Dawn maybe can fill in some more for me also if I don't remember everything. But evaporites, which are chemical precipitants, accumulate as layers through evaporation of marine waters, isolated in shallow bays. And remember that Ohio and a lot of this part of the US, Great Lakes, how it formed from, and we were covered by a saltwater sea. And laying down these layers with the salt, most effective under warm, arid climate conditions, commonly found at latitudes about 30 degrees or less. And so this Great Eastern Salt Basin is distributed through parts of Michigan, Ohio, New York strata from the Upper Silurian Salina group laid down during the Ludlow and Predoli epochs, one of the world's most famous evaporite deposits. A maximum aggregate thickness of 600 meters, 1,970 feet occurs in Michigan, where one individual halite bed reaches a thickness of 165 meters, 540 feet deep. The halite bed, 2 meters, 6.6 feet thick, occurs in the Interlake Formation formed during the Wenlock Epoch in North Dakota. That was from a Britannica article. So Shawnee oral history and salt. Again, I just kept going deeper and deeper into this and finding just some great articles. And George Bluejacket, as you know the name being from Ohio, Bluejacket is, and this was the old spelling of Wapakoneta. So the quote from this source is, George Bluejacket was living in Wapakoneta, Ohio in 1829 when he recorded the history of the Shawnee people.
I'm doing my course.
George Bluejacket was the son of who we know as Bluejacket, the 18th century leader of the same name. Bluejacket devoted much of this narrative to explaining what had enabled Shawnees to endure and thrive in what was known during the 18th century as the Ohio Country. The region, Bluejacket explained, abounded with sapé rivers. I'm not going to try to pronounce this. So the forests and different animals, a reflection of the region's bounty of life-giving resources. But Shawnee origins in their oral tradition, according to Bluejacket, began not with rivers, land, or forest, but with salt water. Long ago, the Shawnees, Gokumpa, grandmother of our people, came out of a great salt sea, holding the tail of a giant panther. The husband followed, carried to shore by a very big swan or goose. Their terrestrial tranquility did not last long. The bad spirit by name here used the great salt water to flood their home, and until everything was swallowed up. So stopping here for a second, what we've learned about Ohio and in this region being covered by salt water and being temperate, and then what we've talked about the Native Americans moving in after the Great Ice Age, and then how the Great Lakes were formed. Quite interesting that the Shawnee traditions talk a lot of things about geology that we didn't learn until much later, that we didn't really understand this before, but that's part of the tradition that was carried down by them. They refer themselves as the water people, and the descendants, they said, did not lose everything to the great salt water. Instead, they made their home on the old sea floor. And this goes back oral traditions far, far, far that we didn't know until much more recently in history about the salt deposits under this area, but the fact that we were covered by salt water. So as they said here, Bluejacket's top tail pointed to a geological truth that would take geologists more than a century to even consider. Modern geology now affirms that parts of present-day West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio once constituted the floor of the Iapetus Ocean, a 600 million year old distinct body of water that preceded the formation of the Atlantic Ocean. It once separated the ancient continents of Avalonia and Laurentia. Remember the Laurentian shield that we talked about here. Roughly 420 million years ago, the tectonic activity brought the two land masses together, closed it, trapped the salt water under a new supercontinent, Pangaea. Pangaea eventually separated, forming distinct continents of Africa and North America, the ocean that now separates them. The salty waters and residue of the Iapetus became locked beneath the central Appalachians and have gradually seeped upwards through millions of years of geologic history. reappearing at the Earth's surface in the form of licks, springs, and seeps. So land bounding by the Appalachians to the east, Mississippi to the west, the Great Lakes to the north, roughly the Cumberland River to the south, constitutes an uncommonly salt-rich region of North America. These mineral pockets became magnets of human and non-human migration to and across Blue Jackets' ancestral lands. This is because the large mammals, like humans, need salt to survive. Though it can vary in compound structure and mineral ratio, all forms of salt consist primarily of sodium and chloride. There's obviously sodium chloride, salt's main homogeneous compound, and it allows animals to retain hydrating fluids, process essential nutrients and minerals, and support microcellular processes critical to circulatory, muscular, and nerve function. Humans relied upon the large mammals for food, and they recognize that dependency, and that's why they stake them out at these salt licks and the salt springs. Said one early 19th century visitor to Kentucky observed they are obliged to give salt to the cattle. Were it not for that, the food that they give them would never make them look very well. So Donna, we've done a show about what shapes our history and how geology has shaped our history. And this is just another example of how things change. And we've talked about glaciation. We've talked about how it affects the flora and the fauna of those regions. And then look at the salt and look at the people following the salt, the animals following the salt. And you wonder about like animal development and why they are where they are, which is very interesting.
Yes, if I can just input, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, you'll remember that when I did my thing about history and nature, the state of Kentucky, its original name came from the Indians, and it was Kentucky. And that was a hunting grounds from the Indians that was sacred, and white men were absolutely forbidden to go there. And it was a sacred hunting grounds because it was absolutely flush with salt licks. And it was someplace that animals, especially deer and bear and bison, knew about, and they would, frequently come in droves to the place. So it was like a shooting gallery for them, for the Indians, and they would, that's where they would go for, a big time for hunting was Kentucky. That was like the easy shooting for them.
At the end of that first paragraph, as it said, May 18th, 1774, they see this from the diaries and things left behind. A British survey party traveled up Kentucky River to a salt spring. They saw about 300 bison collected together.
And that was, the Indians made it very, very clear to people coming to Ohio that you are not allowed south of the Ohio River.
Yep.
And, another thing I wanted to point out too, because there are lists that you can see online, and it's fascinating. One of the things that Lewis and Clark took with them on their expedition was 3 bushels of rock salt. And that may not sound like an awful lot, but it is when you consider how much that is once you refine it down to usable salt for food. And actually, the reason they were not given more than that was it was believed that by the time they got to the West Coast, they would be able to refine more of it from waters and springs that would actually have salt in it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
You read about Lewis and Clark and Jefferson along with it, and Do you have the name of the book handy, Don, that you read?
No, I do not, but there are several online sources that list all of the items that they took with them. And the latest one I had read, which lists everything they took with them, was called modernsurvivalblog.com.
Interesting.
And it just says Lewis and Clark packing list, what they took with them.
So as Don had said, like these licks attracted large mammals. So that would
Yeah.
feed a lot of people. Like how many people for how long does one bison feed? When you're in a hunting party, you can preserve this, making the pemmican and drying it in the fires and stuff. That is a significant source of protein, much needed that the people needed. So that's why the pioneers and the first people through the British and the European settlers learned quickly to look for those licks and look for those salt springs, because like proverbially shooting fish in a barrel here, because there were so many large mammals that were accumulating and they needed the food, and unfortunately we're a bit greedy about it too. But the
Yes,
second
they
program talks about Boone County, Kentucky Big Bone Lick, which is the state park. And the reason why the Big Bone State Park got its name Big Bone Lick was the massive skeletons that were exposed when the British first came in, and the European settlers first came in. They saw these massive skeletons there. And it was awe and attention as the word spread about these areas that had so many huge skeletons. Roads started and waterways started going through these areas with the salt licks and with the salt springs, because people wanted to go to that area to get this and to have the salt sources. And it really affected like what was settled in where. Go ahead.
Yeah, those big animals liked those salt licks. They liked that salt like like cows do today. Those animals liked that salt like kids like candy.
Yep.
And would just go at it endlessly.
Yep.
Mm.
So I need to move on a little bit because I've got a lot of slides.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, they were roads. The buffalo, they call it buffalo with the bison, were beating down the roads, and they could follow this by following the tracks even with these large mammals. So 4 roads converged at Big Bone, each up to 15 feet in width. Like, these are the number of the animals that were moving across here that used to live there. Called it the Great Buffalo Path that they would cross to get over here. One of the oldest paths in Eastern North America. The corridor started somewhere in present-day Illinois, and bison converged by the millions to migrate toward Kentucky and Tennessee for these licks. The path spanned 225 miles across northern Kentucky, connecting at least 4 major springs and licks along the way. I never knew that. Absolutely incredible. I know that of the skeletons they would find along the way and the bones and things, but these are huge numbers. And it really affected, and the resources for the salt really affected the movements of mammals and their hunters pursuing them. And it did for millennia. It did for the natives that lived there before the Europeans got there and took it over. They realized, well, that's how we get food as we start moving westward, and this is what happened. So I did a lot of quotes here. I really was trying to pare this down, but lost the time on here. But it just talks about political instabilities in the area and all the fights over these salt springs and all the major salt areas. And the Shawnees kept bringing in, trying to reinforce to lay clay in the land and maintain vigilance on these networks they had, and because of the hunting grounds also. So this is kind of hard to see. I wish I could blow this up larger. I don't have a huge screen on here, but this is a map of the middle British colonies, as they called it, from 1755. And in the middle and lower left portions of the map, they demarcate the Shawnee territory that spans across the Ohio River And also on the map, if you blow it way up, it locates salt and coal directly beneath this Shawnee town that they called it, and elephant bones, as they call it, which they thought some of the bison bones were, at the site of present day Big Bone Lick. And then it also marked the pathways that connect places like G Buffalo Lick and Escapakiti. But this is from a Library of Congress map that they have, and this was public domain permission that I use this, but kind of interesting to look at these old maps. Don and I are both fascinated by old maps like this and looking at the settlement, but the fact that this was so important, having marked this on the map where these large buffalo runs were, which people then used as their roads too, and knew that this would lead to great hunting resources. So unfortunately, I'm having problems with this running off my map, but salt production, oh my goodness, was very important to the indigenous people who lived here before the European settlers came. And the Ohio country, the Ohio River Valley, Kentucky was very important. That lower Shawnee town that we mentioned before, residents engaged in generations old practice of exploiting rich local springs. Even at January 1751, they called it, bustling lower Shawnee town. Indians and traders make salt for their horses there because the horses need salt to keep going through as well. They used to use shallow ceramic pans for the evaporation process. Their predecessors had used that at least since the 1100s through the early 17th century. Kettles began replacing that to boil down the brackish water to make the salt. See, 1755, hunting party departed Lower Shawnee Town for Big Bone Lick, and they took the kettles and 2 captured colonial settlers with them to make salt, to teach them how to do this more with their kettles. Said perhaps they intended to use the salt to treat hides, to season or preserve meat, or to supplement their trading wares. So how they made salt then, no easy task, no small task. They would have to gather the cleanest brine, and they'd have to closely watch it, constant maintenance, very physically demanding labor to ensure a usable final product. What they said here too was the salt industry, the making of the salt from the water, was more something used by indigenous women at the time in the Ohio country area. And so perhaps that's why one group of Shawnees who captured Daniel Boone and a group of squatters in the winter of 1777 to 1778 forced the male captives to make salt while traveling northward along the Scioto River, because for them that was women's work anyway, and the women did that. Whether it was the physical taxation or the embarrassment of doing women's work under the orders of indigenous men, the captives came to resent the task of salt making. Once captive, James Calloway refused to carry kettles and salt, forfeited by William Brooks. When a Shawnee man took out his tomahawk, Calloway responded with a dramatic defiance: "Strike. I would as lie here as go along, and I won't tote your kettle." After which the salt making gear was assigned to someone else. So he was threatening, saying, "That's women's work, I won't do it." So that's what they were saying. It was salt making was a primary support for indigenous women within their communities and networks, but it also made them targets of gender colonial violence. In early 1778, a group of Muncie, Delaware Americans, Muncie, Delaware women, were making salt at a spring near the Mahoning River. When American soldiers murdered them, there was going to be a retaliation campaign against British allied Seneca and Cayugas. So there was a big bloody war over this one. The women were identified as potential enemies there, and yeah, again, this is over salt. This is Kentucky. This is Ohio, the Ohio Valley. This is now northeastern Ohio. All along the river, it's the same thing repeated in Canada, Pennsylvania, New York. So the women had the knowledge of how to do this, how to extract the salt and make the salt. So I don't know, it's just fascinating history. This is in their pottery. This is one of the things that they used. It was a salt gourd recovered from Kentucky, and they had to just do a drawing to reconstruct it. This is called a pumpkin salt gourd that they have found parts of it. So they had to have ways to store it and carry it also. I am running out of time here, so I've really got to scoot ahead here, but the furnaces that they had throughout Ohio too, part of it's also to evaporate, to bring the salt that they could transport, out of the water from the springs. This is going to be online, so I'll leave this up for just a second here. So this just goes again to some of the attacks. It was just constant. I'm sorry, my show is a bit longer than I intended it to be here, but been still in the 1700s before Ohio was even a state. Terrible attacks over this, and lots of territorial skirmishes over protecting the sources for the salt. This is like the Shawnee strategies to fight back, to maintain their resources. I started reading some Ohio history books about this. I just started cutting and pasting quotes because it's just tumultuous, and how life started here and how the people where they settled was determined by the salt licks and the salt areas also. So I did put in a pretty good bibliography here of lots of reading, and that you can read more and click on the links that we're going to have on the webpage, I guess. And Scioto, Jackson County, Ohio had a lot of salt marshes there along the Scioto. There's a Thomas D. Clark, salt was a factor in the settlement of Kentucky, making salt from ancient ocean trout below the Appalachians, and the Atlas Obscura. So anyway, there are some great resources here, a couple of pages of it. Early salt trade of the Ohio Valley, a place called Bullett's Lick, the related salt works and settlement, salt on the Ohio Valley frontier. The Treaty of Fort Wayne also, very interesting about how they did this. So I've got to wrap up here because of time, and I apologize because I should have just done this in 2 parts. But this week also, I had to put this picture up first. I did see a couple of lifer birds, to switch subjects really quickly. This is a little blue heron, juvenile. Usually in Florida, they're blue with a purplish neck. And I got some great pictures. This was in Hilliard, Ohio, at some areas. It was designated as a park, which there's a lot of building going around there. And this guy's been around for a couple of weeks, a little blue heron. He should be in Florida right now, a little bit up the Atlantic coast, but usually like Gulf of Mexico and all around Florida coast. But this is not a bird that you would expect to see here. It's a lot smaller than like the white egrets. And I just said, when a bird's got to go, a bird's got to go, even if it is rare. But it's a juvenile, probably looking for a nesting area, probably trying to find a pond to fish in to establish territory. But I don't know what blew it up that far off course, but that's pretty incredible. It was very successful fishing. I just didn't watch it. It is just right off the roadway there in Hilliard. And I think it's called Heritage Lakes is the name of the park there. And just incredible. It was fishing and crazy, and it's happy there. And it's the only one of its kind there. And it just was being left alone. And when you pull in off the road, I think it's called Audubon Parkway or something there, you can't miss it. And it's been there for quite a while. It was quite surprising to see that. I've seen them in Florida, but I've never seen them in Ohio. And doesn't happen very often. The one bird that I got was a lifer. This is called a king rail. It's the largest of the rails in probably the world, if not certainly United States, but it's a very large, maybe chicken-sized rail. Very shy, very secretive, and it would pop out every now and then. And I was there maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours before it popped out. And we had given up once, and we're about to give up a second time when all of a sudden I saw it pop out of the reeds. It blends in really closely, and all the people watching for it would say, when it comes out of the reeds, it's there 1 minute and then it isn't. It's like it just fades back into the reeds. But it's quite large, quite long neck. And I was watching the area with my binoculars, and I suddenly saw it stick its neck up out of those grasses and pop up. So that was a live bird this week, and quite rare here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop my share right now. Okay, sorry I had to race through a lot of that, but the the full thing, you can stop and pause.